And which prison did you end up at?
Well, I was in Kent to begin with, and Kent was the maximum. And in Canada, in the West Coast, in British Columbia, they have a different demography. They don't have the racial problem because most everybody's white. Some Indians, but most everybody's white. The problem in Canada is in the West Coast, there's just an amazing number of drug addicts. So the prison is filled with drug addicts. Now, drug addicts make about the worst prisoners in the world because they combine being sleazy with being weak, with ratting people out easily, with being selfish and greedy. And I mean, they haven't taken on the convict ethos, put it that way. So I felt like I had really fallen backwards in terms of the people you were sharing your space with. To be honest, I'd rather be around bank robbers and people like that than drug addicts.
Was it much less violent than California, though?
Well, interestingly enough, it was pretty violent
Was it?
because they in Canada, it's Canada doesn't have the gun crime that America has, even though they have the same number, I mean, of guns held by people. But Canada does have a pretty violent subculture. So Canadians play ice hockey, and ice hockey is basically um, assault with bodily harm as a sport. I don't know if you've ever watched it,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
Canadian ice hockey is, and so there was um, there was also another level is that the worst criminals from Quebec would be sent to the West Coast. Now Quebec has a serious underworld culture. We're talking anything that New York has, Chicago has, Montreal has. The same level of mob assassinations and organized crime, but Quebec is particularly famous for high-powered robbery, armored car robberies with machine guns and all that kind of stuff. And so those kind of guys, they didn't want them in Quebec. So in California, we called it bus therapy. So you move somebody away from where they're familiar. So they would, in Canada, they'd move people from Quebec all the way out to the West Coast where they knew nobody. And that way they hoped to, take them away from their roots and from their support. But those boys were dangerous. And so I knew an English guy, actually, a dope addict, dope fiend. And he'd made some move on one of these Quebecois kids. He cheated him out of something. He got a cuff of drugs from him and then didn't pay him. And the Quebecois just stabbed him right away. I mean, as soon as he didn't pay, didn't have the money, just pulled the knife out and stabbed him. And this English guy was just standing there, almost died. And he was just stunned. He stabbed me. He stabbed me. And he didn't understand because for him, that kind of move in the Vancouver dope world was just run of the mill everyday activity. You stiff other addicts and they stiff you and you steal each other's stashes and whatever. But for those guys, they played by San Quentin rules. So it was a dangerous place. I mean, this American guy had, like me, escaped and jumped the border, got in a shootout with the police there in Saanich. But unfortunately, he had a 410 shotgun with birdshot. So he shot the policeman with birdshot. But all that did is make him angry. So when they had him cuffed, they had him on the ground, and the policeman's partner came up, put his pistol to his head, and pulled the trigger. Now, this American, luckily, when the gun went to his head, he shifted his head by 45 degrees, and it just blew out the skull and eye orbit, and he lost his eye, but he didn't die. And they put his head back together, but it was like a teacup that had been glued. It had pins and things, and he couldn't take a shot to the head. And so they put him in the maximum. And unfortunately for this guy, he had a disconnect in his head between who he was now and who he had been. He had been a hope to die gangster, an escaped convict, and all the rest. But now he was essentially a cripple. And that disconnect caused what came next. The dope addicts, the dope fiends were watching him, and they knew he had some smoke. So they robbed his stash. And he found they robbed his stash. And so he went and put, if you can believe this, he put a sign on the bulletin board saying, I know who did it, and you'll get yours. Now, there's one thing you do in the joint is you never threaten anybody. You either do it or keep quiet, but what you don't do is broadcast that you're going to do it. So he went and did this. And so the dope fiends, they knew this guy was an outright psycho. This guy had beaten an old woman to death because she complained about his Def Leppard music or something like that. Anyway, he was in there, and all he did was just point him in this guy's direction. And he ran in with a weight bar, and he broke the guy's arms and broke his legs, and then whacked him in the skull, shattered his skull again. So I wouldn't say that prison was particularly peaceful.
Did anyone try and test you?
Well, again, I was looking like I looked in that picture. That was taken from the Canadian pen.
Yeah.
And gunfights with the police, the newspapers. I sort of had my mana intact. But of course, they're watching. And a couple of times they tried to trick me into stuff. For example, one time they saw that I was running. I used to run a lot around the track, my weight partner and I. And so one of these guys sent one of these Quebecois fellows up to me, and he said, you got a lot of money on your books. Because at this time, unfortunately, the inmate committee members had access to how much money everybody had on their books. And they saw, I had a job sort of teaching remedial students with this prison educational program, and they paid me real money. They paid me like $1,000 a term,
Wow.
Which for prisoners was huge. And he says, you're the richest inmate in the joint. And I went, oh, shit. Oh, no. So these guys thought how they're going to get me. They saw I was a runner. So they sent this guy to me, and they said, there's some guys want to make a bet, want to make some bets. I said, well, what do they want to make bets on? He says, they bet they can beat you running. He says, and they're liable to put up money, real money on this. And I said, well, how much money? He says, well, I don't know. How much would you be willing to go for? And so we talked some more, and the deal is they've got these one tall, lithe, sporty Indian, and then this half-black guy who's like an antelope. He's naturally athletic. But the thing is, I'd never seen them run before, so I didn't know if they could go the distance or if they were really fast and they'd smoke me or what would happen. So I decided to try and hedge my bets, and I said, well, can I pick out 2 other guys from my team? Seeing as how you got 2 on that team, can we have 3 on our team? And they said, sure, because they didn't think anyone else could run. So they come down to it, and they say, okay, we're going to have a race. How much money are we putting on it? And I say to this Frenchman, because I'm thinking to myself, these guys are trying to set me up. But I thought to myself, if you're going to ambush me, I'm going to ambush you. So I said to the Frenchman, I said, take every bet, take every carton they want to put up. Whatever it is they want to bet, we'll cover it. And he was as happy as could be, because this was real activity, right? The joint, it's pretty slow the every day to day, but now they got something. They're going to have a real race with real money, and these people have real, I won't call it antagonism, but there was this sort of dope fiends from Vancouver on this side, and there were some big, like kingpins from Vancouver, guys who'd like arranged the dope, and they took the whole group, so they had a whole group there. Actually, much like the group you had, right? So the day for the race came, and everybody's out. They're on the bleachers. People are making side bets. All of a sudden, time is real. It's not you're in the prison. You're almost at the racetrack or something, right? And the race starts, and these guys take off. And this black guy, he was like watching an antelope run. He was just smooth and just like silk. And when I run, I go red in the face and I'm chugging away, right? But it's a mile run, and these guys just take off because, of course, they want to look good in front of their mates, right? So away they go, and I'm thinking to myself, you boys, this is a mile run. I mean, do you run?
Jogged. No, I'm not that good.
Well, a mile run's not like 10 kilometers. 10 kilometers you go at speed, but a mile run is a race. Anyway, so the race runs, and I come third, and my other two guys come first and second, and both these guys don't finish the race. So we smoked them. We got all the money.
They paid up.
They paid up because the sleazy dope fiends wouldn't have paid, but the money actually came from the kingpins. For them, it was just entertainment.
Chump change.
Yeah, it's chump change to just be entertained in an afternoon. There's a bit of buzz. Everybody has a good time. So
you said there was a few times they tried to trick you. What else did they do?
Well, I used to run a book, like on betting, because the big problem in the joint is, debts. Like, you might want to bet a game, but do you really have a carton of cigarettes in your pocket to put up on the bet? But if you have somebody who'll take the bets and lay off the bets, who you trust, who'll pay up, then it makes it possible. And I like to, in the joint, you're always looking for something to do. I mean, it's going to be interesting. And so betting on the games was a bit of being outside. It was like, the guys related to it. So I used to take bets. And fortunately, I discovered something which, of course, bookies probably already know. And that's that what you want to do is you want to catch a group of degenerate gamblers. I mean, complete addicts who can't help themselves, but who have money. And fortunately for me, there were two Chinese drug importers, and there was a bent stockbroker. And these guys, the bent stockbroker couldn't, for the life of him, if he bet one side of a bet, you knew they were going to lose. You could just throw your inheritance on it. And so these guys, and so what happened, of course, is that, again, this group, the old kingpins, they start trying to overload me on one side to catch me out.
Mm-hmm.
Now, they were cooler than in San Quentin. San Quentin, the prison gang might just come up on you with knives. These guys were pretty cool. They try and trick you into doing something you're already doing, but push you to go too far.
Mm.
So, fortunately, I was able to, because I had this money, I was able to fund it, and so I never got caught.